He is praised as one of the most significant literary figures of the modern age.
In the 20th century, there aren't as many poets who can really command that ringing line that wants to just beat your heart for you.
William Butler Yeats brought Irish literature to world renown.
I think Yeats is one of the greatest poets since Shakespeare. I think as long as poetry is read and enjoyed, Yeats will be right there with the greatest.
Yeats was much more than a poet. A playwright, politician, and visionary, Yeats was a man driven by deep passions for his country and for the woman he loved.
Yeats is such a passionate poet, and that comes through in his poetry, in the way he writes about love and loneliness and the loss of love and the frustration of being in love. He's the great poet of unrequited love.
On January 30th, 1889, a tall, red-haired beauty knocked at the door of the Yeats family home. Maud Gunn arrived to have dinner with the family and to meet 25-year-old William Butler Yeats, who had just published his first book of poetry, a book filled with Irish mythology and Celtic mysticism. But his writings would soon turn to matters of the heart.
As soon as Yeats saw her, he fell in love with her. And he later wrote that was when the troubling of his life began.
Their meeting sparked an obsession. Yeats would remain under Maud Gunn's spell for the next 25 years. Although they both came from the upper class, the two of them couldn't have been more different. Yeats was an intellectual and a poet, dreamy, sickly, and shy. He preferred reading books to fighting political battles. On the other hand, Maud Gunn was a political rabble-rouser.
Maud Gunn, by temperament, was a person who was always likely to be drawn into active political life in some form or another.
Yeats romanticized Maud Gunn. She embodied his ideal of the perfect woman, beautiful and dangerous.
Wherever she went, she caused a stir. She would step into a room and all eyes would be drawn to her.
Yeats proposed marriage more than once, but Maud Gunn repeatedly turned him down. He didn't give up and wooed her with poetry, baring his heart and creating some of the most enduring love poems of modern literature. Poems like He Wishes for the Cloths of Heaven.
Had I the heavens' embroidered cloths, enwrought with golden and silver light, the blue and the dim and the dark cloths of night and light and the half-light, I would spread the cloths under your feet. But I, being poor, have only my dreams. I have spread my dreams under your feet. Tread softly, because you tread on my dreams.
His poems are so personally powerful. He gives you the emotion of what it's like to feel rejection, remorse, and ecstasy as well.
While Maud was cool to the idea of Yeats as a husband, she encouraged him to channel his passions into his literary ambitions.
There's probably some truth in what she said many years later, that if she had accepted his hand in marriage, he would not have written all those beautiful love poems, poems that are so redolent of unconsummated desire.
Maud Gunn believed Yeats's poetry and the creation of an Irish literary voice would do more for Ireland's independence than her political involvements. After centuries of subjugation by the British, the Irish were hungry for self-rule. Both Yeats and Gunn were passionately committed to Ireland's liberation, but in different ways. Some, like Maud Gunn, wanted a completely independent Ireland and were willing to fight for that. Yeats believed in the power of literature to build an Irish identity and inspire a peaceful transition to independence.
He would be a poet who would give voice to the aspirations of his countrymen and countrywomen, and therefore he began to think about the importance of his poetry as a national voice, embodying the spirit of the nation, if you will. You know, he's actually taking on the role of national bard.
Yeats created poetry that celebrated Ireland's ancient myths and symbols, but in a way that avoided the tired cliches of earlier poets.
He said, we have to get rid of shamrocks, we have to get rid of pepper pots, we have to get rid of wolfhounds and round towers. All the iconography of 19th century nationalism, it had served its turn, and we now have to find a new language and a new set of icons.
Yeats hoped to bring people together and unify the country through a shared love of poetry, drama, and the visual arts. But Yeats knew there was a stumbling block to getting his poetry to the people. Most of the Irish were poor and uneducated.
He realized that if he was going to have an impact, that he had to make his work available to people who couldn't read. And so one of his major impulses was to revive the old oral tradition in Ireland and to make his poetry accessible to the ear. Because if many people in Ireland couldn't read, they could certainly listen. And he felt that they were great listeners.
Yeats wrote poems to be chanted out loud in the tradition of the ancient Celtic bards. Among the new icons that Yeats celebrated was the very landscape of Ireland. His most famous poem, The Lake Isle of Innisfree, evokes his longing for the rural byways of County Sligo, where he spent his childhood summers. In 1932, Yeats chanted the poem for the BBC.
I will arise and go now, and go to Innisfree, and a small cabin build there of clay and wattles made. 9 bean rows will I have there, a hive for the honey bee, and live alone in the bee-loud glade.
It's an exile's yearning for a home. Yeats writes in his autobiography of how living in London, which Yeats never enjoyed living in, they would yearn for Sligo so much that they just wanted a piece of turf from Sligo to hold on to.
I will arise and go now, for always night and day I hear lake water lapping with low sounds by the shore, while I stand on the roadway or on the pavement's grey, I hear it in the deep heart's core.
I love the 3 last lines of that poem, which are impossible to say fast. Deep heart's core. It's about as peaceful and still a line as there can be.
But poetry alone was not popular enough to accomplish all of Yeats's goals. Under Maud Gunn's influence, Yeats became more political. He wanted to engage more directly with his fellow Irishmen and felt that drama, not poetry, would be the best way to do it. At that time, Ireland didn't have a national theatre. 8 centuries of British dominance had all but silenced the voice of Irish culture. With a friend and supporter, Lady Augusta Gregory, Yeats set out to fill this cultural void and founded the Abbey Theatre, the first national theatre of Ireland. Night after night at the Abbey, dramas by Yeats, Lady Gregory, and other Irish playwrights unfolded, bringing to life their vision of a unified Ireland through literature. It was here that Yeats's most celebrated political play, Kathleen na Houlihan, opened in 1902 to sold-out crowds and critical acclaim.
Kathleen na Houlihan is the traditional figure of Ireland. It's imagining Ireland as the poor old woman, a woman who has got too many strangers in the house, by which she means there are too many strangers in her country. On the other hand, Kathleen na Houlihan has the potential for being a beautiful young queen.
The fiery leading lady was none other than Maud Gunn.
So this tall, statuesque figure dressed up in these old widow's clothes. And at the end, when she unveils herself and stands up to her full height and you see her beauty, had a very great impact on the theatre audience.
People felt that this was a very eloquent and moving testament to the power of patriotism. And yet some people felt that so patriotic was it that it was almost dangerous.
While the play was inflaming nationalist feelings, Yeats was basking in its triumph. He was on top of the world. But less than a year later, he was in the depths of despair. The love of his life, Maud Gonne, had just married another man.
He goes through a very interesting period in 1903 when he learns that Maud Gonne has married John McBride. It has such a tremendous impact on his art that he plummets like a plane from the heavens, from the visionary down to the real world. And from 1903 until 1917, he writes no visionary poems.
John McBride was everything Yeats was not. A major in the military and an Irish nationalist, McBride was willing to take up arms to fight for independence. In April 1916, against popular opinion, a small band of Irish nationalists took over the Dublin post office and launched what became known as the Easter Rising. By the end of the week, the British military had suppressed the uprising. Dublin lay in ruins, and the instigators of the revolt were thrown in prison. Had that been the end of it, things might have returned to normal. Most Irish thought that the attempted overthrow had done more harm than good.
People were stunned, and people felt that these people were extremists who would stop at nothing to prove a point. They really felt these people were rocking the boat.
But British firing squads turned the hapless rebels into heroes. 15 were executed, including Maud Gonne's husband, John McBride.
After the British executed the leaders, opinion began slowly but surely to change. People began to have more sympathy with the rebellion and all it represented.
Yeats memorialized the event and his mixed feelings about it in a poem entitled Easter 1916, which concludes with a haunting refrain.
Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith. For all that is done and said, we know their dream. Enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excessive love bewildered them till they died? I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and McBride and Connolly and Pierce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born.
That oxymoronic, terrible beauty, which doesn't make any sense. Beauty shouldn't be terrible, and yet it makes perfect sense, and we all know exactly what he's talking about. When beauty is made out of something so horrible as these people being killed.
It is considered one of the finest political poems of the 20th century. Why? Because on the one hand it commemorates the heroism of the rebellion, but on the other hand it counts the cost in human terms.
The death of John McBride left Maud Gonne free to remarry. 25 years had not diminished Yeats's love for her, and now, at age 52, he proposed once more. Again, and for the last time, she turned him down. Yeats finally accepted the fact that he and Maud would never marry, though they would remain friends until the end of his life. But Yeats then proposed to Maud Gonne's 22-year-old daughter Iseult, with whom he had been friends for many years. She also refused.
Both of the Gonnes, very wisely, were consistent in their refusals.
He finally turned to a young friend and kindred spirit, Georgie Hyde Lees. Even though Yeats was 25 years older, she immediately accepted.
It almost seemed like an afterthought, I couldn't get the one I wanted, so here's, number 3. He really was determined to get married. However, it is also true that Georgie Hyde-Lees knew exactly what she was getting into. She was nobody's fool, and she chose him in full recognition of what a mess it was likely to be.
Yeats instantly regretted his decision to marry, and on their honeymoon he fell into a deep depression. Then something happened. Georgie began to write what she described as messages coming from the spirit world.
In the midst of Yeats being very depressed about the whole thing, she attempted the automatic writing, which became almost immediately intensely interesting and important to both of them.
Yeats was captivated by Georgie's automatic writing. She would empty her mind and then spontaneously fill pages with writing and images. The process drew Yeats out of his depression and opened up a world of deep spiritual inquiry that they explored together.
She later confessed that when she did this, she did it wittingly. She knew that she was faking at the beginning, but then something else took over, and that what had begun as a subterfuge to cheer her husband up actually became, for several years, a systematic exploration.
It's a system to explain everything. History, psychology, what happens to the soul after it dies, all in one appropriately aesthetic unit. They decided something real and of vast significance was happening. And they did automatic writing together almost every night for years.
Georgie and Yeats were part of a spiritual community that conducted magic rituals and seances. They consulted horoscopes and the stars for guidance. They believed that the automatic writings could help them see into the future.
According to the theory of history of the automatic script, this is the end of a 2,000-year cycle. The 2,000 years that were ushered in by the birth of Christ. These 2,000 years have been a time in which the reigning ideas were ideas like democracy and love of neighbor and thinking that everybody is equal and that we can all participate in something generous and good. And the one that's coming is going to be the mask of that. It's going to be the opposite of that. It's going to be a time in which democracy is not the reigning paradigm. The reigning paradigm is going to be power. Somebody is going to have power over somebody else. Hierarchy.
Yeats captured this apocalyptic view of the world in his poem, The Second Coming.
Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image out of Spiritus Mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man. A gaze blank and pitiless as the sun is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches towards Bethlehem to be born?
It's about the fear of contemporary revolutionary times, and it talks about that fear in larger terms. If we are afraid, what is that all about? It evokes that sense of, wondering about things, worrying about things, thinking about what meaning there may be, and then blammo, there's a moment of revelation, and there's something coming. It appears, it scares the living daylights out of you, and then the darkness drops again.
From his darkest visions to his greatest joys, Yeats's poetry deepened as a result of the automatic writings. He tapped a rich vein of creative energy to explore all aspects of his life and work.
There's such exaltation, such a flow of new poems. One of my favorite is Tom O'Reilly, where he says, "Wisdom is a butterfly and not a gloomy bird of prey." The mind is moving again like a butterfly into the visionary world and is not weighed down by the gloomy hawk of thought that has paralyzed him for so many years.
During his lifetime, Yeats saw his vision for Ireland's independence realized, though more violently than he imagined. After a bloody war of independence which split the country in two, Southern Ireland became a free state in 1921, and Yeats became one of its first senators. Maud Gonne played no small part in the upheaval and spent time in jail for her radicalism. In 1922, Yeats achieved international acclaim by winning the Nobel Prize for Literature. He was hailed not only for bringing literature to the common man, but also for his profound contribution to contemporary poetry and drama. In his later years, Yeats moved with Georgie to the Irish countryside, where they lived in an old tower. He took an honest look at growing older and explored ways to fully embrace his art.
At this time, in his 60s, he was very conscious of age and consciously moving away from the natural world of procreation and becoming increasingly concerned with creation.
Yeats wrote about the lasting value of art that endures beyond one's lifetime in Sailing to Byzantium, one of his great visionary poems, written in 1926.
And so you imagine Yeats now standing at the top of his tower, looking out on the natural world and saying, "That is no country for old men, the young in one another's arms, birds in the trees, those dying generations at their song. An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick, unless soul clap its hands and sing, and louder sing, for every tatter in its mortal dress." That's my exaggeration, perhaps, of the way it would have been chanted, except there are notes that give us very precise details from the BBC scripts in that second stanza when he says, "An aged man is but a paltry thing, a tattered coat upon a stick." If you just read it like that, it's prosaic. But he said, "An aged man is but a paltry thing." He wanted the bitterness of being an older man there, and then he wanted the lines run together: "Coat upon a stick, pause, unless." And then comes the "unless soul clap its hands and sing," and then you're off, into what the old man prizes and the creation of monuments of an aging intellect. And for that reason, he's leaving that country and going to Byzantium. The creative imagination, great stuff.
Yeats's creative imagination left a lasting imprint, not only on Ireland, but on all of English literature.
Yeats did invent Ireland. I think that's one of the real reasons why people keep reading him, is that he somehow managed to take his little piece of the planet and find what it had meant for other people, but then create it as what it meant for him.
The reason that Yeats is such a great poet is he addresses both the intellect and the heart. And so, although his poetry is rooted in Irish literature and tradition and culture, his themes are very much universal, like that of all the great writers in the past.
Yeats continued writing poetry until his death in 1939 at the age of 73. He wrote his own epitaph in a poem called Under Ben Bulben, the name of a famous mountain in his native Ireland and the place where he is now buried.
Under bare Ben Bulben's head in Drumcliff churchyard, Yeats is laid. An ancestor was rector there long years ago. A church stands near, by the road an ancient cross. No marble, no conventional phrase. On limestone, quarried near the spot, by his command these words are cut. Cast a cold eye on life, on death. Horseman, pass by.